So if you really need GDP to make stock market go up, you would think, boy, oh boy, the Chinese stock market has to have been a really great place to be. And I wish 10 years ago I bought stocks. Well, if you actually bought stocks 10 years ago, the Chinese market is flat to 10 years ago. It is easy to see why so many people are fixated on GDP and why so many people falsely believe that you need good GDP to have the stock market do well. Now, whenever I hear anybody say something like that, you need X to get Y in the stock market, I then ask myself, well, how many data points we got? So in the time period where we've got really good accurate data for the S&P 500, you got 97 years. And last I checked, every year has 4 quarters. And every quarter gets a GDP report. And therefore you can check to see, with lags or not, how the stock market's done against GDP reports. And you know what the correlation coefficient of that is? Now, I've always been a big fan of checking correlation coefficients because if there's no there, that tells you that X doesn't cause Y. But you can see some more dramatic examples. Now, mind you, you can always find examples that confirm your core belief. You can always find quarters where GDP was strong and the stock market did well. That doesn't mean that you need strong GDP to make the stock market do well. Let me just give you 2 sets of examples that show that the reverse is true. The stock market is a leading indicator. So regularly, at every bear market bottom, you have the following, which is the beginning of a bull market. And yet in those bull markets, whenever there has been a recession, which is most of them, the economy keeps getting worse and for a long time after the bottom while the stock market's going through the roof. You follow that? At the beginning, the stock market goes down with GDP. After that, the stock market goes up while GDP is falling. Let me give you a different, in some ways, more dramatic example, because some people will say, and I understand the logic here, that, well, maybe not in the short term like the example you just used around bear market bottoms, Ken. Maybe instead, in the long term, we need GDP to do well in the long term or the stock market won't do well. And again, in my heart, I can feel the beat for that. But let me make a point. GDP measures the size of the economy. It's not perfect, but that's what it's all about. I mean, there are no constructed indexes of things like that that measure precisely. That's a different topic. But generally, GDP is a measure of the size of the economy. And so economies that grow more have GDP going up more, and economies that shrink have GDP falling. And GDP as a calculation isn't that bad. So what economy do we all know about that's grown one heck of a lot in recent decades? Grown a lot more than the United States has? Might be maybe China? Can you think of a big economy that's grown more than China over the last decade? So if you really need GDP to make stock market go up, you would think, boy, oh boy, the Chinese stock market has to have been a really great place to be. And I wish 10 years ago I bought stocks. Well, if you actually bought stocks 10 years ago, the Chinese market is flat to 10 years ago. Flat. To 5 years ago, it's negative. Now, mind you, the US market and the world market are both hugely positive over those times. I want to reiterate, last 5 years, Chinese stock market's negative. Last 10 years, Chinese stock market's flat. There must be something else going on besides GDP. You follow that? And I'm not suggesting that GDP growing is a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's a good thing for people, and it may or may not contribute to a given stock market movement. But when I was young and took econ in school, heaven forbid, you know, they taught you to think a little like a scientist does, because it's a social science, that you're supposed to see how things work if you vary one variable and hold everything else constant, otherwise known as other things equal, or in Latin, as I learned it at the time, ceteris paribus. The fact is, in the real world, that never happens. In the real world, everything is dynamic. And if one thing moves, just the movement of that one thing impacts something else. So what goes on? Well, as I wrote about in my Only Three Questions book at great length, and as I also wrote about in Debunkery, where this is coming from in this discussion, where I used China as an example, but that was some years back and we didn't have these last 10 years. The fact is that supply in the long term is the singularly most important, powerful thing in determining pricing. Pricing comes from shifts in demand and supply, and shifts in supply in the long term are more powerful than shifts in demand, because shifts in demand, as I explained in the Only Three Questions, comes in a more finite bandwidth than shifts in supply. Shifts in supply can always overwhelm demand, which had been the case in China on the one hand. And on the other hand, despite the growth in recent years, China has increasingly become restrictive in its liberties and its freedom, which has hurt sentiment. And so the market hasn't done so well. There's always multiple variables going on all at one time, and GDP alone is just one of them. Growth in the economy is just one of them. And in that, what I want you to see is that the notion now that GDP growth may not be so strong is in and of itself telling you nothing about where the stock market is going to go in the next 6 months. The fact of the matter is there's all these other variables. They all play together, and it is only one piece, and it's far from the most important. I believe in the months ahead, you will continue to hear discussions about GDP, and I want you to remember that that's one and not so terribly important overall. Thank you very much for listening to me. I very much hope you enjoyed this video as part of my series on debunking common market myths. To watch more videos like this, click the link on the screen and make sure to subscribe to Fisher Investments' YouTube channel. Thanks so much for listening to me.